And now I am really pleased to introduce our keynote speaker, Kate Gordon. Kate is one of those women who has taken on important and tough challenges. She was appointed director of the governor's office of planning and research, and also as senior advisor to the governor on climate by Governor Gavin Newsom in January of 2019. Kate has a number of accomplishments, but one that really jumped out at me because I remember this from a few years ago. She ran the Risky Business Project, and they issued a seminal study in 2014. They looked at the devastating the impacts of climate change on the US economy and really modeled and quantified these impacts. So Kate, thank you, and tell us about California moving from ambition to action.
Thank you so much, Martha. It is so great to be here. I'll say a couple things, then I'm gonna have some slides. But it really is a pleasure to be with C3E. I have made my career focusing on big gaps in sort of the economic development intersection with energy and climate, and a lot of those are in kind of traditionally male fields: industrial energy, labor and just transition issues, carbon removal. A lot of guys in those conversations, and it's been really thrilling over the past couple of decades to see the increasing number of women in these fields. It's a testament to this community and mentorship that you've created here, and just the fact that we have each other's backs. I'm really proud to be in a state where we require there to be women on corporate boards because we recognize the need for those diverse viewpoints and experiences, and frankly, different ways of approaching problems. And so just really, really an honor to be here. I'm going to start my slides, so just give me 1 minute here. There we go. All right. I hope that worked. Somebody can tell me if it didn't. So just real quickly, Office of Planning and Research, everyone who's not from California always wonders what that is. This is a cabinet level office within the governor's office. We have responsibility for long-range planning and long-range advice to the governor and cabinet on a variety of issues that really overlap with our climate challenges: land use and planning, climate resilience, calculated climate risk, sustainable economic development. We're not specifically an energy agency, but energy touches every one of these areas. Obviously, land use in terms of siting and balancing of needs, the resilience of our energy system, particularly with the wildfires we've been experiencing, jobs and economic opportunities in the energy system, and the overall transition to carbon neutrality. Increasingly, all of these things are incredibly integrated, which is really the governor's approach. Governor Newsom and our whole administration has taken an intersectional, integrated approach to climate change, where every sector and every region and every issue has an influence on every other one, and we look at those areas of intersection. The Office of Planning and Research and my role as senior advisor on climate is by definition intersectional. I get to look across the landscape, which is why I wanted this job, frankly, because that's been my experience. That's what I like to do on climate and energy issues. But in fact, the entire administration, every agency, everyone in the governor's office takes this kind of approach that recognizes the interplay of these policies, the regional nature of our impacts and solutions, and the importance of equity underlying every decision that we make. We are in the Newsom administration building, of course, on major gains that were given to us from the Brown administration. The Brown administration was really forward-thinking on climate, and enormous international leadership, incredibly ambitious goals. Governor Brown really was a global leader, is a global leader on these issues. Governor Newsom now faces the task, and I think this is true for a lot of countries and states and subnationals that have taken leadership positions. We're now in the position of having to make all that real. We have recommitted to a goal of carbon neutrality by 2045. We need to make real progress in every sector toward carbon neutrality while facing, let's face it, incredible headwinds from COVID and from our wildfires in particular. Those headwinds show up in our budget. They show up in where we are able to spend our mind share and time. It is extraordinarily hard to work on the long-term aspects of climate change and our energy system when you're dealing with crises every day. I know all of you know that. California, though, I feel has the opportunity now to lead, not just on setting goals, but to lead on taking action. We have the opportunity to lead on showing what the transition can look like, showing that an economy of our size, the 5th largest economy in the world, with the diversity that we have. Look, we have oil and gas production. We're the largest manufacturing state. We have a huge agricultural sector. We have an opportunity to lead in showing that a diverse, significant economy can do this transition, can continue to build and rebuild the economy, can continue to grow using best available technology, best available financing strategies, and practices around stakeholder engagement that frankly we're missing in the building of the economy we're in today. The governor has we've taken on a couple of key areas of focus, and we did that in a data-driven way. One of the first things the governor asked me to do when I started was he said, look at all of our goals, and you would be amazed by how many there are. And all I looked at was statute, executive order, and regulation, and it's a lot. Look at our goals, see where we're making progress, see where we're lagging. And the reality is the transportation jumped out. In California, transportation is 51% of our emissions. That's when we include the impact of our transportation fuels production and refining, but it's 41% without that. So it's enormous. It's a technology challenge, it's a fuels challenge, it's a land use challenge to change that. Our transportation system, we need to see fleet turnover of our vehicles, both light duty and heavy duty. We need to see a major change in our fuels toward electricity in particular, but also more renewable liquid fuels. And we need to seriously address our land use. Our vehicle miles traveled are a huge part of our transportation challenge. This year, the governor put out an executive order that calls for us to essentially all zero emission vehicle sales by 2035 in light duty and 2045 in medium and heavy duty, building on an executive order from last year asking our transportation agency to realign all of our transportation decisions toward our climate goals. He's also called on us to create a just transition executive order, our just transition roadmap underlying that transformation. So this is a huge part of our agenda and a complex one. We also have not made enough progress in integrating our natural and working lands into our climate strategy. We know from the UN International Panel on Climate Change that lands must be part of a climate strategy. In California, here's an amazing fact. 40 million people in California live on just 6% of our land. 47% of our land is federal, 25% is agricultural. We have a huge amount of natural and working land that needs to be put to work in reducing emissions, in acting as a carbon sink, not a carbon source, in helping us build resilience to things like fires and floods, to protect biodiversity. Our lands are part of our solution, and we are dedicated to working on that. It also requires a really honest conversation about rural equity and inclusion, something that has not always been part, frankly, of the equity conversations in California or across the United States. The governor this year put out an executive order calling for 30% of our land and coastal waters to be protected and conserved by 2030. That is a huge deal, that 30 by 30 commitment. We're the first state to do that as a formal commitment. And it's forcing us to really think about what that looks like and how to maximize land conservation, which doesn't mean you can't use it. It just means that it's being protected from development. How do we maximize land conservation toward these climate goals? Again, an integrated approach to how we think about our land sector. I was glad to see Coalition for Green Capital as a sponsor. We're very focused on climate finance as an underlying structure that has to change to recognize two things, both the fiscal stress from the current climate events that we're experiencing and to seize the opportunity and invest in avoiding what we call transition risk, avoiding stranded assets, making sure that we're getting ahead of this transition. I cannot underscore how big of a deal this is in California. And I think that we're kind of the canary in the coal mine in this, to be honest. We spent $1 billion this year on firefighting, people and equipment. That is $650 million over budget. Our budget is increasingly being used for emergency response, for the safety net programs we have to put in place around emergency response, for instance, increased unemployment, increased healthcare costs, help with relocation, support for mental health challenges. These are major government responsibilities that are taking on a larger and larger part of state budgets and increasingly national budgets. Balancing that, making sure we're looking at resilience, not just response, and balancing it with mitigating long-term climate impacts is a significant challenge that we face as a state, and I think more and more jurisdictions are facing. This is also something where we need to partner really closely with our federal and international partners. Ultimately, the incorporation of climate risk and opportunity into our budgeting, into our operations, into how we think about infrastructure is something that has to happen at a national level and international level. We need to be thinking about this across all decision making, not as a side project, just on impact investing, just on new technology, but really part of every decision we make. This is an area where equity must be at the center, because honestly, if you go without thought down the road of reducing climate risk and changing investment strategies around climate risk, you risk disinvesting in vulnerable areas, disinvesting in areas where people are already stressed, already the most vulnerable communities. That's something we have to avoid, and that's another balancing act. Our state has done a number of things along these lines. I'm really proud that that the governor has essentially last year made the case that California is ourselves a major asset owner, a major investor, and that we need to be best in class. We need to be aligning around smart climate goals, aligning around reducing our risk. And we've done that in a number of ways through existing decision-making in our major asset owning agencies, Department of Transportation, our Department of General Services, which owns and operates buildings and fleets for the state. We've also, the governor has called for a climate investment framework for us to work collaboratively with our pension funds on these issues. We have just joined the International Coalition for Climate Resilient Investment, which is looking at best practices around the world on reducing physical risk from climate. And we are putting together a climate risk disclosure work group to look at where and how California can think about climate risk disclosure in our own operations and working with our pensions. So we really are taking this seriously. Again, it's an area where we're being very operational. We're not putting out goals that we can't meet. We're trying to figure out exactly how to do this and learning from best in class around the world. The big question facing us across the board in everything we do, and this is the big question when we think about transition into a carbon neutral economy, a net zero economy, how do we grow a more sustainable and more resilient and more inclusive economy while protecting our most vulnerable communities? This transition will not succeed if it's not inclusive and equitable. The impact of COVID on our economies underscores what happens when we ignore this basic reality, when we ignore inequality, when we allow for communities to be redlined out of opportunity. With this, COVID has been a stark reminder of what happens, and we cannot let that happen as we rebuild our state economy, our national economy, our international economy. We have to do things differently. And in California, you know, we recognize this. We are trying to think about how to incorporate racial equity and climate justice goals into the work we're doing across the board. One example of that is the California Strategic Growth Council, which is run through my office. It's a council of 7 cabinet level agencies plus 3 public members working on programs that are at the intersection of climate, housing, and transportation, as well as avoided land conversion of agricultural land. We have all committed to a resolution that says each of our agencies will commit to integrating racial equity into our own practices and programs, but also into the policies that we promote. So we're developing racial equity action plans. We are presenting those twice a year. 2 out of the 6 meetings of the council are dedicated to this issue. We are very, very focused on how to make this operational. The Capital Collaborative on Race and Equity is part of the Government Accountability on Race and Equity Program, or GARE, which many of you may know. We all participate in that, every one of those agencies, among many, many more. And that is a set of trainings and best practices around how to incorporate racial equity into our decision making. And so we're learning all the time. We just put together a task force on business and jobs recovery, which included across the task force a commitment to equity in all our decision makings. And one of the key things that came out of that task force was a health equity metric in our COVID planning. California has declared that when we look at counties and how they're meeting their COVID metrics, we look at the most disadvantaged regions in each county. We don't average across the county. Your county is only as good as the numbers in your most disadvantaged communities. That means that we're automatically incorporating some of these racial disparities, income disparities from COVID into our decision making. And finally, in land use planning, we're looking at, but we just put out environmental justice planning guidance, looking at how local governments and counties can think about the history of redlining and other planning practices as they do forward-looking planning. We're also coming up with a mapping system for vulnerable communities who are vulnerable to the climate impacts we're currently feeling. So a huge amount of work in this case, and I know Yana Garcia from our California EPA will be on a panel later, and she really is at the center of this work and just a true leader on it. And then finally, in terms of our equity work, I think sometimes we separate out equity from jobs, which I have an economic development background. To me, that just doesn't make sense. The reality is you don't have equity if you don't provide economic opportunity. There's absolutely, we have got to address historical systematic racism. We have to address pollution. We have to address what's happening currently in these communities, but we also need to be laser focused on opportunity. And actually, Martha's story at the beginning about her work with the, helping farmers get a living wage with Brazil nut planting was really, I think, telling. We do this in international work a lot. We think, oh, of course, we have to think about fair wages, fair labor standards. We have to think about fair trade when we think about climate goals. We interestingly don't do that as much in our domestic work. And in California, we really feel that worker voice and economic opportunity are part of a equitable climate agenda. The governor's called for my office to work with our labor department on a just transition framework. We are really looking at that as a sustainable economic development agenda for the state. We cannot transition to carbon neutrality if we don't diversify the economies currently dependent on oil and gas. We cannot move to carbon neutrality if we don't make our technologies and our practices available to lower income Californians. We cannot do this on the backs of our top 1% to 3% income earners buying the new technologies. We really have to look at a much more inclusive system going forward, because that's ultimately what will make this succeed. As a strategy for all Californians and as a proxy really for everyone. Again, California is a complicated and a huge state, and in some ways a microcosm. Rural and urban divides exist here. We have fossil fuel production. We have a vulnerable grid. Many of the issues we're dealing with are happening across the country and across the world, and we really are looking at finding a better way forward. There's so much to do. There's an enormous amount to do. The thing about taking an integrated approach is it sometimes feels overwhelming, but I am confident that the combined ingenuity and creativity and sheer grit of all of us working together can get it done. And I'm particularly optimistic because so many more of us are women. Some people say working on climate issues is a marathon and not a sprint. I think it's an ultra marathon. It is an endurance sport, if ever there was one. And look, women excel at those. We're good at that. We know how to dig in. We know how to get stuff done. Thrilled that C3E is part of the solution and that you have asked me here today. And I just can't wait to get to work with all of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Kate. Thank you for telling me I was muted. We'll be looking to California to continue to provide us with groundbreaking climate justice and mitigation policies. So what a pleasure to have you here.